Today we are taking a look at why nations fail. And this book really dives into some big questions
It does.
about why some nations prosper while others fail.
Yeah.
And I think something that a lot of people have wondered throughout history.
Yeah.
And this book really tries to tackle it head on.
Yeah.
So
It does.
I'm excited to jump in.
Yeah, me too. And, I think what I find so fascinating about Acemoglu and Robinson's work is that they take these kind of common explanations that we often hear, like, oh, it's the geography or the culture that determines whether a nation will be rich or poor.
Right.
And they really systematically dismantle those arguments.
Yeah.
And they say, no, it's really about the institutions, the rules of the game that shape how a society functions.
So not just the laws on paper, but like the deeper sort of power structures,
Yeah,
the way that things actually work in practice.
Exactly. And they use this great example in the book, the Nogales paradox, to kind of illustrate this point. And so imagine you have these two cities, right, called Nogales on the U.S.-Mexico border.
Okay.
One Nogales, Arizona, the other Nogales, Sonora, Mexico.
Gotcha.
And they're literally separated by a fence.
Okay.
And on the U.S. side, you have a relatively prosperous city,
Right.
relatively low crime rates.
Yeah.
Decent public services.
Yeah.
And on the Mexican side, you have much higher poverty.
Like higher crime.
Less opportunity.
Yeah.
And so the question is, like, what explains that difference?
Right. Because you would assume
And this is the paradox.
if it was just geography, they're literally right next to each other.
Same geography.
But it can't be that.
Same people in many cases.
Right.
Families split across the border. Same culture.
So what is it?
And so what they argue is that the only real difference is the institutions.
Okay.
The rules of the game on the U.S. side, you have a different set of institutions that provide more economic opportunity,
Gotcha.
more property rights, a more stable legal system.
Right.
Whereas on the Mexican side, historically, you had much weaker institutions.
Right.
And that has led to this divergence in outcomes.
So it seems like what they're saying is that institutions matter more than these other factors that we often hear about, like geography or culture.
Exactly. They're not saying those things don't matter at all, but they're
Okay.
saying that institutions are the kind of fundamental operating system
Okay.
of a society. And if you have a system that's built on extraction.
And what do you mean by extraction in this case?
Yeah. So what they mean by extractive institutions are institutions that are designed to benefit a small elite
Okay.
at the expense of the majority of the population. So think about like a dictatorship
Gotcha.
where you have a small group of people at the top
Right.
who are extracting resources from the rest of the country.
Yeah.
They give a really, really, I think, powerful and kind of disturbing example in the book about colonial Peru,
Okay.
where they talk about how the Spanish conquistadors came in and they encountered the Inca Empire, which had this system of forced labor called the mita.
Okay.
And rather than getting rid of that system
Right.
and establishing something different,
Yeah.
they basically said, hey, this is great free labor.
Wow.
Let's just adapt this to our own purposes.
That's terrible.
And they used it to force the indigenous population to work in the silver mines.
Oh, wow.
And it's a very stark example of how extractive institutions can be self-reinforcing.
Yeah.
Because the Spanish benefited from that system,
Right.
and so they had no incentive to change it.
Wow. Yeah. So it seems like this idea of extraction versus what do they call the other kind of institutions?
Inclusive.
Inclusive institutions.
Yeah, so they contrast extractive institutions with inclusive institutions.
Okay.
And inclusive institutions are institutions that are designed to benefit a broader segment of the population.
Okay.
So they typically involve things like secure property rights,
Okay.
a rule of law that applies equally to everyone,
Gotcha.
and a level playing field where people can start businesses.
Mm. Right. And have access to education and opportunity. So it's not just about being nice. It's about actually creating a system
Exactly.
where more people can participate and benefit.
It's about creating a system that allows for what they call creative destruction.
Okay. We're going to have to come back to that.
We're going to come back to that.
That sounds fascinating.
But it's this idea that in order for a society to progress,
Yeah.
you need to allow for new ideas and new technologies
Okay.
to kind of disrupt the old ways of doing things.
Gotcha.
And that often means that some people who are benefiting from the old system are going to lose out.
Right. Like in the case of the Spanish and the silver mines, like they don't want to give up that power.
Exactly.
So how do you get from those extractive institutions to inclusive institutions?
Yeah, that's the billion-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. It is.
I mean, that's what the whole book is really trying to grapple with.
And we're going to grapple with it too, but we're going to take a quick break and come back to that after the break.
Sounds good. So this idea of creative destruction, you would think that new ideas and new technologies would be welcomed with open arms.
Right, because they lead to progress, right?
Exactly. But the reality is that often the people who are in power, the people who benefit from the existing system, they have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo.
Because it's working for them.
Exactly. And they may even fear these new ideas and these new technologies because they threaten to disrupt the existing power structure.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. So it's not just about, like, being afraid of the new thing itself. It's about what that new thing represents.
Exactly. And they give this great example in the book about a guy named William Lee
Okay.
back in the 16th century in England.
Okay.
And William Lee invented this machine called the stocking frame knitting machine.
Okay, so this is like early Industrial Revolution time.
Exactly. And this machine had the potential to revolutionize the textile industry because it could produce stockings and socks much more efficiently than traditional hand knitting.
So it's like one of those moments where technology is about to just completely change the game.
Exactly. And so Lee, he's so excited about his invention. He goes to Queen Elizabeth I.
Bold move.
He's like, "Your Majesty, I have this amazing invention that's going to make England rich. It's going to create jobs. It's going to be fantastic.
Everyone's going to have warm socks.
Everyone's going to have socks." But Queen Elizabeth, she looks at this machine and she says no.
She rejects it.
She rejects it outright.
Why?
And her reasoning was that she was concerned about the potential for unemployment.
Because if this machine can do the work of like 100 hand knitters,
Exactly.
then those 100 hand knitters are out of a job.
Exactly. And so Acemoglu and Robinson, they argue that this is a classic example of what they call creative destruction.
Okay, so explain that a little bit more. What do they mean by creative destruction?
So creative destruction is this idea that in order for progress to happen, you have to destroy the old ways of doing things.
Gotcha.
And that often means that some people are going to lose out.
Right, like in this case, the hand knitters.
Exactly. And so the question is, like, how do you manage that process?
Right.
How do you create a system where you're allowing for this creative destruction to happen?
Right.
Because you want the progress.
You want the progress.
But you also don't want to leave a bunch of people behind.
Yeah, you don't want people to be worse off because of it.
Exactly.
So it's about finding that balance.
It's about finding that balance, and it's about creating institutions that can help to mitigate the negative consequences of creative destruction.
Okay, so how do you do that?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And there's no easy answer.
Right.
But one thing that Acemoglu and Robinson emphasize is the importance of inclusive political institutions.
Okay, so we're back to institutions.
We're back to institutions because they argue that if you have a system where a broader segment of the population has a say in how society is governed,
Okay.
then you're more likely to get policies that benefit a broader segment of the population.
So it's about having a system that's responsive to the needs of the many, not just the few.
Exactly. And they give a number of examples in the book of how this has played out in history,
Okay.
both positive and negative.
Give me an example of each. Like, give me an example of where it worked well.
Yeah.
And then maybe an example of where it didn't work out so well.
Sure. So one example where they argue it worked well is the case of England,
Okay.
which we talked about earlier.
With the socks.
With the socks, yes.
The unfortunate socks.
Unfortunate socks. But, even though Queen Elizabeth rejected William Lee's invention,
Right.
England eventually did become a hotbed of industrial innovation.
Right.
And they argued that one of the reasons for that was that England had relatively inclusive political institutions for the time.
Okay, so even though the Queen kind of messed up with the socks,
Right.
overall, the system was set up in a way that allowed for that kind of progress to eventually happen.
Exactly. They had a parliament, they had a system of checks and balances, and so even though the Queen could kind of put the brakes on things temporarily,
Right.
he couldn't completely stifle innovation.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about an example of where it went wrong?
So on the flip side, they talk about the example of the Soviet Union,
Okay,
which had a very extractive political system.
right.
And they argue that this ultimately led to its economic stagnation and collapse.
Because they were so focused on, like, maintaining their own power
Exactly.
that they stifled any kind of innovation or progress.
Exactly. And they were very good at certain things. Like, they were very good at mobilizing resources for big push industrialization.
Right.
Like, they were able to build Sputnik.
Right, the space race.
Right. But they were never able to create a dynamic, innovative economy.
Because they didn't have that kind of bottom-up,
Exactly.
like, entrepreneurial spirit.
Exactly, because they were too busy extracting resources from the rest of the economy.
So it was like they could force a certain kind of progress, but they couldn't create the conditions for like sustainable
like
long-term growth.
exactly. And that's really the key difference, I think, that Acemoglu and Robinson are trying to highlight.
So it seems like what they're saying is that if you want to create a truly prosperous society, it's not enough to just have like a good leader or a few good policies.
Right.
You need to have a system
A system.
that's set up in a way that encourages participation
Yes.
and innovation
Yes.
and protects individual rights.
Exactly.
And that's hard.
It is hard.
It's really hard. And it's something that we're still struggling with today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look at the world around us. I mean, we're seeing a lot of these same dynamics playing out in
Right.
different ways in different places.
So this book is not just like a history lesson. It's like,
No.
it's relevant to what's happening right now.
It's incredibly relevant.
Yeah.
And it provides, I think, a really useful framework for understanding some of
Yeah.
the challenges that we're facing.
Okay, so for those of us who are like, wanting to be engaged,
Mm-hmm.
citizens wanting to make a difference,
Yeah.
what are some of the key takeaways from this book? Like, what are some of the things that we should be paying attention to in the world around us?
Well, I think one of the key takeaways is that institutions matter
Okay.
and that we should be paying attention to the way that our societies are structured
Okay.
and the incentives that those structures create.
Gotcha.
Another key takeaway is that change is possible,
Okay.
but it's not easy.
Right.
And it often requires a sustained effort over time.
So we can't just like rest on our laurels and assume that things are going to be okay.
Exactly.
We have to keep working at it.
We have to keep working at it. We have to be vigilant.
Don't be vigilant.
And we have to be willing to challenge the status quo when it's not working.
Because those extractive forces, they're always going to be there,
They're always going to be there.
trying to like pull us back.
Trying to pull us back to that kind of zero-sum
Right.
worldview.
Where it's like, if someone's winning, someone else has to be losing.
Exactly.
And so it's about fighting against that and saying, no, we can actually create a system
We can do better.
where everyone has a chance to succeed.
Exactly.
I love that message.
Yeah.
All right, so that's creative destruction.
That's creative destruction.
Institutions.
Why nations fail.
Why nations fail. What else we got? So, okay, let's talk about Rome.
Yeah,
Because ancient Rome seems like a good example of this,
it does.
where you had a society that had some inclusive elements.
Yeah.
They had a republic, they had a senate,
Right.
but it ultimately collapsed.
It did.
So what happened there?
Well, I think Rome is a classic example of how a society can start down a path towards inclusiveness,
Right.
but then kind of lose its way.
Right.
And, in the early Roman Republic, you had a system where, citizens had a say in government. There were some checks and balances on power.
Right.
But over time, as Rome became more powerful, as it expanded its empire,
Right.
a small elite emerged that was able to kind of rig the system in their favor.
Okay, so it's like the more successful they became,
Right.
the more they kind of lost sight of
Ex-
those inclusive principles that had made them successful in the first place.
And they started engaging in a lot of the same extractive behaviors
Yeah.
that we were talking about earlier. They were exploiting conquered people.
Right.
They were enriching themselves at the expense of the common good.
Yeah, and it seems like that's a pattern we see throughout history,
It is.
where power corrupts and
It's very difficult.
yeah, it's very difficult to maintain those inclusive systems, especially when you have these powerful forces
Right.
that are benefiting from the status quo.
It's hard to share power once you have it.
Right, exactly. And so what can we learn from that? I mean, what are some of the things that we can do to try to avoid those same pitfalls?
Well, I think one of the key lessons from Rome and from a lot of the other cases that they talk about in the book is that we have to be constantly vigilant
Vigilant.
about protecting our institutions
All right.
and about making sure that they're serving the interests of the many, not just the few.
So it's not enough to just like establish good institutions. We have to actually like actively defend them.
You have to actively defend them against those who would seek to undermine them.
Right. And it seems like that requires like a certain level of civic engagement.
It does.
Like we can't just like elect someone and then hope for the best.
Right.
We have to actually like hold our leaders accountable
Hold them accountable.
and be engaged in the political process.
And I think the other thing that's really important to keep in mind is that this is not a spectator sport.
Right?
Building a just and prosperous society requires the active participation of everyone.
It's a team effort.
It is a team effort, and it's something that we have to be constantly working on.
So it's not about like achieving some kind of utopia.
Right.
It's about constantly striving
It's a process.
for a better future. Yeah.
And it's a process that requires us to be informed, to be engaged, and to be willing to hold our leaders accountable.
I love that. So essentially what you're saying is read the book,
Read the book.
Why Nations Fail.
Why Nations Fail.
Think critically about the world around you and get involved.
Get involved.
I love it. That's awesome. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
This was fantastic. And to all of our listeners out there, thank you for joining us as well. We hope you found this conversation thought-provoking and maybe even inspiring. And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.